All right, let's dive into brain theory today.
You all right?
We're going to be tackling Jeff Hawkins's thousand brains theory.
Oh, cool.
Have you heard of this one?
I have, yeah. It's a fascinating one.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
What's interesting about it is that it really tries to get at this question that's been around for a long time. Like,
Yeah.
what does the neocortex do?
Right.
How does this wrinkly outer layer of our brain, how does that give us intelligence?
Yeah, I think about that a
Yeah.
lot. Like, what makes us us?
Exactly. And Hawkins, he's been researching this for decades.
Okay.
He's proposing a totally new way of looking at the neocortex.
Okay.
So instead of it being like this big central processor,
Right.
he's saying it's actually made up of thousands of smaller independent units all working together in this like super intricate way.
So instead of like one mega brain, we have thousands of mini brains working together.
Yeah, and that has some pretty big implications for how we understand intelligence,
I bet.
both biological intelligence and artificial intelligence.
So let's set the stage here a little bit.
Sure, Dave.
We're talking about the neocortex, which a lot of people know is this newer part of the human brain.
Right, it's like the part that's responsible for all the things we think of when we think of intelligence,
Wow.
like language and reasoning and problem solving.
Right, right.
And it makes up a huge amount of our brain, like 75% of our brain volume.
Wow, that's a lot of space dedicated to thinking.
It is. It is.
But this thousand brains theory is saying that this huge neocortex
Right.
isn't just one big thing.
Right.
It's made up of these tiny repeating structures called cortical columns.
Yes, exactly. And these columns are really interesting.
Okay.
They're tiny, like the width of a couple strands of hair,
Wow.
but they're packed with billions of neurons organized in a very specific way.
So these columns are like the thousand brains.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Hawkins is saying that each of these cortical columns is like a self-contained learning system that can build its own model of the world.
So each of these tiny columns is like its own little brain.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Yeah, that's a lot.
But stick with me here. It gets really interesting.
Okay.
Okay, so imagine you're holding a coffee mug.
Okay, I've got a coffee mug in my hand.
Now, according to the thousand brains theory, each of the columns that's getting sensory input from your hand,
Uh-huh.
it could be learning a complete model of that mug.
So like one column is focused on the texture, another on the shape, and another one on the weight.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And by combining all of that sensory information, each column is forming like a really detailed representation of that mug.
Okay, but if we have all these columns, thousands of them,
Yeah.
each with their own model,
Yeah.
wouldn't that create a really fragmented, chaotic perception of the world? Like, how do we experience one mug and not 1,000 different versions of it?
That's the big question, right? And that's where this idea of voting comes in.
Okay.
Hawkins says that these columns, they're not isolated.
Mhm.
They're always communicating with each other, comparing their models, and basically voting on what they're perceiving.
So it's like a brain democracy.
You could say that, yeah.
Right.
And this collective decision-making, that's what helps resolve ambiguity, smooth out those discrepancies, and create that, like, single unified experience we have.
Okay. I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Good.
But I got to say, this whole thousands of independent brains working together, it seems so different from how we usually think about the brain processing information.
It is different.
You know, that classic hierarchical view where sensory input goes through these different stages and gets more and more complex.
Right, the traditional view.
Yeah.
Well, the thousand brains theory really challenges that idea.
Why is that?
Well, because the brain is way more interconnected than we once thought.
Okay.
It's much more dynamic.
So this theory offers a much more flexible model,
Exactly.
one that can handle the crazy complexity of the real world.
That's the idea.
Okay, so we've got these cortical columns
Yes.
acting like little brains, building models of the world. But how do these columns know where they are in relation to the object they're sensing? Like, that seems really important for building an accurate model.
You're right. That is really important. And that's where this really cool thing comes in. Grid cells.
Okay, grid cells, I've heard of those.
Yeah, so they're these special brain cells that were discovered in the entorhinal cortex,
Mm-hmm.
which is this area involved in navigation and memory.
Right.
And what's so cool about them is they create a spatial map of the environment.
Like a built-in GPS.
Exactly. And this discovery led Hawkins to propose this really revolutionary idea.
What's that?
What if grid cells aren't just in the entorhinal cortex?
Okay.
What if they're actually in every single cortical column?
Oh, wow.
So in the case of your coffee mug, the grid cells in each column would be mapping your finger's location relative to the shape of the mug.
So instead of mapping physical space, they're mapping the object itself.
That's the idea. It's a bold hypothesis, but it's getting more and more support from research.
So we've got these cortical columns, each acting like a tiny brain.
Yes.
building models of the world. And they've got these grid cells that are making these maps
Right.
so they can understand their sensory input.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It is incredible.
And we're just scratching the surface here.
I bet.
In part 2, we're going to dive deeper into how these thousands of mini brains work together to create this seamless experience of reality we have,
Okay.
and what it all means for the future of AI.
This is shaping up to be one of our most interesting deep dives yet.
I think so too.
I can't wait for part 2.
Me neither.
So last time we were talking about how our neocortex could be made up of thousands of these tiny independent units,
Yeah, like mini brains.
all building their own little models of the world.
Each one with its own grid cell map.
Yeah, to create like their own reference frame for understanding stuff.
Exactly.
So it's almost like our brain is having this constant internal debate
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
with all these columns weighing in on like how they see reality.
Now think about like walking into your favorite coffee shop. Your senses are going crazy.
Right.
You smell the coffee.
Oh, yeah.
You hear the chatter. You feel the warmth of the sun.
That sounds nice.
Right.
So my brain would just be buzzing
It would be, yeah.
with all those columns working, processing everything.
Some columns might be focused on recognizing the barista's face.
Oh, yeah.
Some on trying to figure out the menu.
Uh-huh.
Others on imagining the taste of that first sip of coffee.
Probably where this is going.
Right.
Yeah.
And as you move through the shop, interact with everything.
Yeah.
All of those columns are updating their models, making predictions about what's going to happen next.
So if I reach for my wallet,
Right.
some columns are already predicting what the leather is going to feel like.
Yeah. The weight of the coins, the sound of the zipper,
Wow.
it's all happening in the background.
So that's how we move through the world so smoothly, right?
It is. It's like the foundation of our reality.
It's not just seeing, it's like anticipating
Yeah, constantly predicting and responding.
based on all these mini brains working together.
Exactly.
Okay, but what about more like abstract things?
Right.
Like you can't just be coffee cups and baristas.
Of course not.
How does this explain stuff like language or math or even emotions?
Well, that's where this theory gets even more interesting.
Right.
Hawkins says those same principles apply to abstract concepts, too.
Oh, well.
He suggests that ideas like justice or infinity or even love,
Okay.
those are also represented by these patterns of activity across the columns,
Just like physical objects.
just like physical objects.
So when I'm like having a deep conversation,
Yeah.
there's a whole network of columns firing away.
Each one adding its own understanding.
Wow.
And just like we can smoothly move our focus from the handle of the mug to the smooth side,
Mm-hmm.
our thoughts can shift from one concept to another.
Guided by all those connections.
That's
So it's
right.
like those aha moments.
Right.
It's not magic. It's just all these tiny insights coming together.
I like that. Yeah.
And this has to have huge implications for things like AI. Because, traditional AI has always struggled with that kind of like flexible intelligence.
Right. They're good at specific things,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't have that general understanding of the world.
Which is where Numenta comes in.
Yes.
The company that Jeff Hawkins founded
Uh-huh.
to research and apply the thousand brains theory to AI.
They're really trying to understand the fundamental principles of intelligence.
It's like cracking the code.
It is, using the brain as their guide.
And one area where they're making progress is robustness. Like making AI systems better at dealing with errors.
kind of like our own brains.
Yeah. Remember sparsity?
Yeah.
That idea that only a small fraction of our neurons are active at once.
Right. Well, Numenta has been putting that idea into their networks.
Interesting.
And the results have been pretty amazing.
What kind of results?
Well, for example, they've shown that with image recognition,
Okay.
their networks can identify objects even when the images are messed up,
Oh, wow.
like distorted or covered in noise.
So it's like recognizing your friend even if they're wearing a disguise.
Exactly.
Mm.
Traditional AI would have trouble with that.
Yeah.
But these new networks can handle it.
Because they're learning from the brain.
Right. And that's just one example.
Cool.
They're also working on continuous learning,
Okay.
which is the ability to adapt to new info on the fly, just like we do.
So instead of needing these massive data sets.
Yeah, they can learn from their experiences.
Oh, that's cool.
Just like those early attempts at riding a bike you mentioned,
Yeah.
each mistake helps refine the model.
So if our brains are always predicting
Yeah.
and kind of running these simulations of the world,
Mm-hmm.
is that what gives us consciousness?
Now that's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
The Thousand Brains theory doesn't have all the answers,
Okay.
but it definitely offers a new perspective on it.
It seems like we're on the verge of some really big breakthroughs
I think so too.
in understanding the brain.
And what it means for AI.
But I'm really fascinated by those Object-centric reference frames. Those grid cells seem to be the key
They might be.
to unlocking a whole new level of understanding.
And that's exactly where we'll pick up in part 3.
Okay.
We'll dive into the latest research on grid cells
That's good.
and how Numenta is using that to create intelligent machines that can understand the world just like we do.
I can't wait.
It's going to be exciting.
Welcome back to our deep dive.
It's great to be back.
I'm telling you, after the last 2 parts, I'm like looking at the world totally different.
I bet it makes you think about things a little differently, doesn't it?
It really does. It's like I never really thought about how my brain actually works, you know?
Right. And that's the power of a theory like this
It
one.
makes you question everything.
Makes you rethink all those assumptions we have.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about these object-centric reference frames,
All right.
because those seem to be like a really key part of this whole thing.
They are, yeah. They're how all those mini brains can create a unified model of the world.
Okay, so those grid cells we talked about, the ones that create those maps.
Yeah, like our brain's GPS.
But Hawkins is saying they might be in every column, not just the ones that are for navigation.
That's right. He's proposing that instead of mapping physical space, they're mapping the structure of objects themselves.
So each column has its own coordinate system for whatever object it's sensing.
Yeah, like a little internal map for each object.
Okay, that's pretty wild, but how does that actually work?
Well, imagine you're holding that coffee mug again,
Oh, I got my mug.
and you're feeling the handle with your fingers.
Okay.
Each column that's getting input from your fingers is using its grid cells to create a map of that handle.
So like the grid cells are firing in a certain pattern
Exactly.
that represents the shape of the handle.
The texture, the temperature, all of it.
So they're building this whole 3D model in my head.
A dynamic model, always updating as you move your fingers.
So it's more than just a picture of the mug.
Right, it's a much richer model,
Yeah.
capturing all its properties and how it interacts with the world.
And it's not just visual, right?
No, it's all the senses.
So like the sound the mug makes.
The aroma of the coffee, the warmth of the ceramic.
Wow, so it's like a little virtual reality simulation of the mug.
That's a great way to think about it.
And that's what lets us interact with the world so smoothly.
It is, yeah. We can predict how objects will behave, how they'll feel.
Before we even touch them.
Exactly. And that's the power of these object-centric reference frames.
So that's what Newman is trying to do with AI.
Yeah, they believe that if we can understand the neocortex,
We can build machines that can understand the world like we do.
and they're making some real progress.
It feels like we're on the edge of something big.
I think so too. It's an exciting time for AI.
But it also feels like there are a lot of big questions we need to answer.
Absolutely, like how to make sure these technologies are used ethically.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation.
But this Thousand Brains theory, it's definitely given us a lot to think about.
It really has. It's changed how I see the world
It's a theory that makes you appreciate just how amazing our brains are.
and the possibilities for the future.
Absolutely. So if you want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out Jeff Hawkins' book and Numenta's research.
Yeah, it's some really fascinating stuff.
Keep those thousand brains buzzing.
Well, that's all for this episode of The Deep Dive.
It was great talking about this with you.
Thanks for joining us.